The fluorescent lights of the Metropolitan General Hospital didn't just illuminate. They hummed with a sterile, aggressive energy that seemed to vibrate in Sarah's teeth. At 29, Sarah moved with a rhythmic grace that belied the heavy industrial cart she pushed through the oncology wing. She wore a dark blue janitor's dress, the fabric stiff with starch, and her hair was pulled back into a tight, practical bun. To the surgeons rushing past, she was a ghost in polyester. To the grieving families, she was part of the furniture. But Sarah saw everything. She saw the way a doctor's hand shook before a difficult consult. She saw the dust motes dancing in the sterile air, and she saw the man in room 412. His name was Kang Minho, and the whispers in the hallway said he was a king of the underworld, a man whose word was law in the shipping docks and the neon-lit gambling dens of the city. At 36, he should have been in his prime, but he lay beneath the bleached white sheets like a fallen statue. His skin was the color of old parchment, and his breathing was a shallow, ragged staccato that filled the room with a sense of impending finality. 22 doctors, the finest minds from Seoul to New York, had stood at the foot of that bed. They had analyzed his blood, mapped his genome, and debated his demise in 3 different languages. They called it an idiopathic multi-system failure. They called it a mystery. Sarah called it a tragedy. She stood in the doorway, her hands gripped tight on the handle of her mop. The room smelled of antiseptic and the faint, metallic tang of blood. Minho's eyes were closed, his long lashes casting shadows against his hollowed cheeks. He was handsome, even in the grip of death, with a jawline that looked carved from granite and a quiet dignity that the hospital gown couldn't strip away. Sarah stepped inside, the squeak of her rubber-soled shoes echoing like a gunshot in the silence. She didn't start cleaning. She just watched the way his chest moved. There was a hitch in his breath, a tiny, microscopic pause that didn't match the rhythm of the ventilator. She had seen that hitch before, years ago, in a place far away from these polished tiles and high-tech monitors. She remembered the heat of the desert, the smell of burnt oil, and the way a man's body reacted when it was fighting something the eyes couldn't see. She wasn't just a janitor. She was a survivor of a war that didn't have a name on the evening news, and she knew the look of a body that was being poisoned by its own history. The chief of medicine, Dr. Harrison, was a man who measured his worth by the length of his CV and the sharpness of his lapels. He stood in the hallway, surrounded by a gaggle of residents who hung on his every word like disciples. They were discussing Minho's declining vitals, their voices hushed but clinical. Sarah stood nearby, buffing a section of the wall that didn't need buffing, her ears tuned to their conversation. Dr. Harrison sighed, a sound of practiced exhaustion. "We've exhausted the toxicological screen," he said, tapping a tablet with a manicured finger. "There is no trace of known neurotoxins, no heavy metals, and the autoimmune markers are inconclusive. At this rate, Mr. Kong will not survive the night. It is a failure of the body to sustain its own spark." Sarah felt a cold knot of frustration tighten in her stomach. She looked through the glass partition at Minho. His fingers were twitching, a tiny, rhythmic pulse against the bedsheet. It wasn't a seizure. It was a signal. She waited until the doctors moved on, their white coats fluttering like the wings of scavenger birds. She stepped back into the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew the risk. People like her didn't speak to people like them. She was supposed to be the background noise of the institution. But she saw the twitch again. It was a pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Her breath caught in her throat. He wasn't unconscious. He was trapped. She moved to the side of the bed, leaning over the man who had supposedly ordered the deaths of dozens, yet now looked as vulnerable as a child. "Mr. Kang," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic rasp. "Can you hear me?" The twitching stopped instantly. His eyelids fluttered, revealing a sliver of dark, clouded iris. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. "I'm not a doctor," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "But I've seen this before. In the military. We called it the silent rust. It's not a poison they teach in medical school. It's an old-world preservative used in the shipping containers you own. If it gets into a wound, it mimics organ failure. It hides in the fat cells. They aren't looking for it because they think you're sick. They don't realize you're being preserved alive. Minho's hand suddenly shot out, his fingers locking around Sarah's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a dying man. His grip was cold, but his eyes were burning with a desperate, lucid fire. "Help," he wheezed, the word barely a ghost of a sound. "Help me." The confrontation happened in the middle of the nurse's station, under the harsh glare of a dozen overhead lights. Sarah stood her ground, her blue dress a stark contrast to the sea of white lab coats. Dr. Harrison looked at her as if she were a piece of equipment that had suddenly started making an annoying noise. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. "You think we've missed a preservative? A chemical used for coating industrial crates?" Sarah didn't flinch. She had faced down men with rifles in the mountains of Cunner. A man with a stethoscope wasn't going to break her. "It's called phenol, D3, she said, her voice steady through a laceration and binds to the nervous system. "Your scans won't show it because it has the same molecular weight as certain glucose chains. You're feeding it to him every time you put him on a sugar drip." A young resident chuckled, but Harrison silenced him with a look. "And how, pray tell, does a member of the sanitation staff know about specialized industrial toxins?" Sarah took a step forward, the space between them shrinking until Harrison had to tilt his head back. "Because before I cleaned your floors, I was a combat medic with the 10th Mountain Division," she said. "I spent 2 years treating men who were poisoned by the very supplies they were guarding. I know the smell of it. It's on his breath. It's sweet, like rotting peaches. Go back in there and smell his breath, doctor. Or you can keep standing here being right while he dies." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the tension of 100 unspoken biases. Harrison looked at the other doctors, his ego warring with the tiny seed of doubt Sarah had planted. Finally, he turned back to her. "If you are wrong, and you have interfered with a high-profile patient, I will ensure you never work in this city again." Sarah didn't blink. "If I'm wrong, he's dead anyway," she replied. "But if I'm right, you're the one who almost killed him." Harrison glared at her for a long moment before spinning on his heel and marching toward room 412. Sarah followed, her hands trembling now that the moment of defiance had passed. She watched from the doorway as the doctors crowded around Minho. Harrison leaned down, his face inches from the dying man's mouth. He stayed there for a long time, his expression shifting from skepticism to a deep, haunting realization. The next 4 hours were a blur of frantic activity. The sugar drips were disconnected, replaced by a high-dosage lipid emulsion that Sarah had suggested, a treatment used to scrub the blood of fat-soluble toxins. The atmosphere in the wing had shifted from the quiet gloom of a morgue to the electric intensity of a battlefield. Sarah had been ordered to stay in the break room, a small, windowless box filled with the smell of burnt coffee and the hum of a vending machine. She sat on a plastic chair, her head in her hands. She could lose everything. Her job, her pension, her anonymity. She had spent years trying to disappear, trying to forget the sounds of the desert and the weight of the lives she couldn't save. Now she had stepped back into the light, and the light was blinding. The door creaked open, and Dr. Harrison walked in. He looked older, his pristine white coat wrinkled and stained with sweat. He didn't speak at first. He walked to the coffee machine, poured a cup of the sludge-like liquid, and sat down across from her. "The labs just came back," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "You were right. Phenol, D3. It was concentrated in his biliary tract. Another 12 hours of the glucose drip and his heart would have simply stopped. We would have called it natural causes." Sarah let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a decade. "Is he?" "He's stable," Harrison interrupted. "He's awake. And he's asking for the woman who told him he was being preserved." Sarah felt a wave of relief so strong it made her dizzy. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "Why are you here, Sarah? A woman with your training, your instincts. Why are you mopping floors?" Sarah looked down at her calloused hands. "Because floors stay clean if you work hard enough," she said softly. "People don't. In the army, I saved people just so they could go back out and get blown up again. Here, I thought I could just be invisible. I thought if I didn't care, it wouldn't hurt when they died." Harrison nodded slowly, a newfound respect in his gaze. I think Mr. King might have something to say about your invisibility. He's a man who pays his debts, Sarah. And right now, he owes you his life. When Sarah entered the room this time, the guards were back. Two men in sharp, black suits stood by the door, their faces like stone. They moved to block her, but a weak, raspy voice from the bed stopped them. Let her in, Minho said. The transformation was already beginning. The gray tint was leaving his skin, replaced by a faint, healthy flesh. He was propped up on pillows, his dark hair messy, but his eyes sharp and piercing. He watched Sarah as she approached, his gaze taking in every detail of her uniform, the way she carried herself, the strength in her shoulders. You saved me, he said, the words simple and heavy. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, her hands clasped in front of her. I just saw what they didn't, she replied. Minho smiled, a slow, dangerous, and beautiful expression. They didn't see because they didn't want to. They saw a patient. They saw a paycheck. You saw a man. He reached out and touched the bruise on her wrist where he had gripped her earlier. I'm sorry for this, he whispered. I was drowning. Sarah looked at the mark. It's okay. I've had worse. Minho's expression darkened. My enemies thought they were clever. They thought a slow death would look like a natural one. They didn't count on a warrior in a blue dress. He leaned back, his eyes never leaving hers. What do you want, Sarah? Money? A new life? I can give you anything. Sarah looked around the sterile room, then back at the man who held the city in his palm. I want to not have to hide anymore, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I want to be able to look at a person and not see a casualty. Minho nodded, a silent vow forming in his eyes. Then that is what you shall have. From this day on, you are not a ghost. You are under my protection. And the world will know your name, not as a janitor, but as the woman who beat death when 22 geniuses failed. He reached out his hand, and for the first time in years, Sarah didn't feel like a shadow. She took his hand, and as the morning sun began to bleed through the hospital blinds, the cold blue of the room was finally washed away by the warmth of a new day. She had stepped out of the silence, and for the first time, the world was listening. The aftermath of the miracle didn't bring the immediate peace Sarah had anticipated. Instead, the hospital became a pressurized chamber of whispers and sideways glances. The news of a janitor overriding the diagnostic authority of the board of directors spread through the sterile corridors like a fever. Sarah continued her shift, her mop bucket trailing behind her, but the rhythm was broken. Nurses who had previously looked through her now paused, their eyes darting to her hands as if searching for the hidden power she possessed. In the cafeteria, the air grew thick with the scent of cheap coffee and unspoken resentment. She sat alone, staring at the reflection of the fluorescent lights in her water bottle. The invisible wounds she had carried from the service, the hypervigilance, the weight of the lives lost in the dust of distant valleys, felt heavier now that her cover was blown. She missed the safety of being a ghost. Suddenly, the chair across from her scraped against the linoleum. It was the young resident who had laughed at her the day before. He didn't look like he was laughing now. His face was pale, and he held a thick medical file in his trembling hands. They're trying to bury it, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the vending machines. The hospital administration. They're classifying your intervention as a procedural anomaly and moving to terminate your contract for a breach of safety protocols. They can't have the world knowing a cleaning lady saved their most valuable patient while the department heads were picking out headstones. Sarah didn't look up. She felt a familiar, weary coldness settle in her chest. It was the gallows humor of the survivor. I guess the truth is bad for business, she said, her voice a dry rasp. The resident pushed the file toward her. It's more than that. The toxicology report I ran on the side. The one Harrison told me to delete? It shows the phenol, D3, wasn't just an accident from a shipping crate. It was spiked into his medication right here in the pharmacy. Someone didn't just want him to die. They wanted the hospital to do the killing for them. Sarah's fingers tightened around her water bottle. The mystery wasn't over. It had just changed shape. She wasn't just a savior anymore. She was a witness to an attempted assassination. The underdog arc was shifting from a medical miracle to a struggle against institutional corruption. She looked at the resident, seeing the fear in his eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "Because I remember why I became a doctor. And it wasn't to watch a warrior get silenced by a man in a suit." The walk back to the oncology wing felt like a march through a minefield. Sarah kept her head down, but her senses were dialed to the maximum. She noticed the subtle shift in the security detail, new faces, men with hard eyes and ill-fitting suits that didn't match the hospital's standard private firm. They were positioned at the elevators, their hands hovering near their jackets. The metaphor of light versus dark felt literal now. The bright, sterile hallways felt like a trap, while the shadows in the utility closets offered a grim sanctuary. She reached room 412, but the door was barred by a man who looked like he had been carved out of a mountain. "No one enters," he said, his voice a low rumble. Sarah didn't back down. She held up her mop as if it were a scepter. "I have to clean the floor." Hospital policy, the man's eyes narrowed, but before he could speak, the door opened. Minho stood there, leaning heavily on a cane, his face a mask of stoic pain. "Let her in," he commanded. The guards stepped aside instantly. Inside, the room was a chaotic mix of high-tech medical equipment and the sudden intrusion of Minho's private world. 3 laptops were open on the bedside table, scrolling through lines of code and shipping manifests. Minho looked at Sarah, his gaze softening. "They're coming for you, aren't they?" he asked. Sarah leaned her mop against the wall. "They're firing me. And someone in your circle is paying the pharmacist to keep you preserved forever." Minho didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "In my world, loyalty is a currency that devalues faster than the one. I suspected my second-in-command, but I didn't think he had the reach to touch this place." He walked toward her, his movement slow but deliberate. "You are a soldier, Sarah. You know that when you find the sniper's nest, you don't just hide. You take the shot." Sarah looked at the reflection of the polished tiles, seeing 2 survivors reflected in the shine. "I'm out of the war business, Mr. King." Minho reached out, his hand steady as he tilted her chin up. "The war never leaves us, Sarah. It just changes fronts. They think you're a janitor. They think I am a corpse. Let us show them how wrong they are." He handed her a flash drive. "This contains the encrypted logs of every shipment that entered the Busan docks last month. I need your eyes. I need the medic who knows how to spot the poison before it's poured." The night shift was a slow burn of tension and rhythmic clicking as Sarah sat in the darkened records room, the glow of the monitor illuminating her face. She was using the military-grade decryption skills she hadn't touched in years, her fingers flying across the keys with a precision that would have terrified Dr. Harrison. The hum of the fluorescent lights above felt like a ticking clock. As she cross-referenced the chemical signatures of the phenol, D3 with the hospital's procurement list, the hidden truth began to emerge. It wasn't just one man, it was a structural rot. The hospital's board had been taking donations from a shell company linked to Minho's rival, a man who wanted to monopolize the shipping lanes. The medical failure wasn't an accident, it was a business strategy. Sarah felt a surge of righteous fury. It was the same coldness she had felt when she saw contractors cutting corners on body armor in the desert. She was the underdog, the quiet hero, but she was no longer unseen. She heard a soft click behind her. The door to the records room opened, and Dr. Harrison stepped in, his face obscured by the shadows. "You should have taken the severance package, Sarah," he said, his voice devoid of its usual polish. "You're a very talented woman, but you don't understand the scale of what you're touching." Sarah didn't turn around. She watched his reflection in the dark monitor. "I understand that you're a murderer, Doctor. Or an accomplice. I haven't decided which is worse." Harrison sighed, a sound of genuine regret. "This hospital provides care for thousands. If Mr. Kang dies, the funding continues. If he lives, the donations stop, and we close our doors to the poor. It's a simple equation." Sarah finally turned, her eyes flashing with a stoic fire. "Life isn't an equation. And you don't get to decide who is a variable." She held up the flash drive. "I've already sent the logs to the district attorney and a contact I have in the military police. The invisible wounds you thought you could hide are about to go public. Harrison's face contorted, but before he could move, the room was flooded with light. Minho's guards were there, along with the young resident and a pair of uniformed officers. The triumph of the underdog was no longer a dream, it was a tactical reality. The final act of vindication didn't happen in a courtroom, but in the main lobby of Metropolitan General. The morning sunlight streamed through the massive glass windows, casting long, golden shadows across the floor Sarah had polished 1,000 times. A press conference had been called, not by the hospital, but by Minho's legal team. The Mafia boss stood at the podium, looking every bit the high-status power player, but his eyes were fixed on the woman standing in the back of the room, still wearing her dark blue janitor's dress. He spoke of the corruption, the attempted assassination, and the failure of the elite. But then he paused. 22 doctors looked at me and saw a dead man, Minho said, his voice echoing with a dramatic, inspirational weight. But one woman looked at me and saw a human being. She saw what their pride made them blind to. He gestured for Sarah to come forward. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Sarah walked with a steady, contemplative pulse, her heart no longer hammering, but beating with the calm of a soldier who had completed her mission. She stood beside the man she had saved, the contrast between his expensive suit and her humble uniform a visual testament to the story's core truth. Minho turned to her, his voice dropping to a whisper that the microphone still caught. "You told me you wanted to not be invisible anymore." He then addressed the cameras. "This is Sarah. She is a veteran, a medic, and the reason I am standing here. She is no longer an employee of this hospital. She is the new director of patient safety for the Kong Foundation." The room erupted in a cacophony of camera shutters and shouted questions, but for Sarah, the world went silent. She looked at the polished tiles one last time, seeing not just a floor to be cleaned, but a reflection of a woman who had reclaimed her soul. The story ends not with a shout, but with a breath. A few weeks later, Sarah sat on a park bench overlooking the city harbor, the warm morning sunlight on her face. She was no longer wearing the blue dress. She wore a simple in and out of the docks. The silence between them was no longer heavy with the subtext of death, but light with the ease of survivors. "Do you miss it?" Minho asked, his dry humor peeking through. "The quiet of the hallways?" Sarah watched a group of children playing near the water, their laughter a soft, affectionate sound in the distance. "I miss the simplicity," she admitted. "But I like being able to look people in the eye." Minho looked at her, his expression one of deep, human conviction. "You saved more than just my life, Sarah. You saved my belief that there are people who can't be bought." He handed her a small, weathered book, a collection of poetry they had discussed during his recovery. Inside the cover, he had written, "To the warrior who saw the light in the dark." To all of you watching, remember this. The world is full of people who think they are invisible. But courage isn't about being seen. It's about seeing. It's about the strength to speak when the room is silent and the heart to care when the world is cold. Thank you for joining us in this community of kindness and courage. Until next time, keep looking for the truth in the shadows. The story of the janitor and the king is over, but your story is just beginning. Stay brave. Stay human. Good night.